Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Maybe It Resonates. This is going to be exploring the spiritual framing of my experiences with psychosis, or episode 1 through a spiritual lens, or aspects of episode 1 through a spiritual lens. So, the spiritual framing of my psychotic experiences. I'm still using that word because it's so loaded, and I kind of want to use it against the system, against all the clinical people, because they'd be shit scared if they were experiencing psychosis, wouldn't they? But it's not something I'm particularly scared of anymore. I should probably talk about why that is now. In therapy circles, I've been to therapy with the NHS and whatnot, group therapy and things like that. And obviously lots of individual meetings with psychiatrists and psychologists. The psychologists I've worked with have been pretty cool actually, but I suppose they're artists in a way, aren't they? You get a BA in psychology rather than a BSc if you're doing a degree, or an MA rather than an MSc. So psychology is kind of, I don't want to say fluffy, but open to interpretation. It isn't clinical. You can be a clinical psychologist, but it's not black and white per se. Neuroscience would be kind of the scientific version, wouldn't it? I suppose. So yeah, in my dealings with psychiatrists, most of them, not all of them, my current psychiatrist he's very clinical, but he's a man of African heritage, so he's a bit odd, people say. I would say he's odd. I think odd is cool. Odd just means different, isn't it? You're the odd one out. You're not like everybody else. So high praise indeed, really. And in therapeutic circles with sort of group psychotherapy, I'm doing art psychotherapy at the moment. Art psychotherapy for psychosis. And psychosis is kind of this thing that's framed as terrible. Obviously because it leads to people being sectioned, and there's a lot of fear there in the experience anyway, the lived experience of that. But as I alluded to in episode 1, I think that fear is the kind of thing we need to sort out to resolve some of this. If you could remove the fear aspect of it, I think fear is a big trigger for kind of losing touch with reality, or the material realm, or consensus reality, and the ideal goal, at least for me, and again, speaking from all my opinions, and I think and I feel when I'm speaking. I'll try and say that a bit, just so it's not confusing, because if I'm saying something I've read, well, I should say I've read this or I've read that. So I'll try and be a bit more clear in my communication, because I am someone who likes clear communication. So I should try and adhere to my own preferences. Because if I was a listener, I'd probably have got pissed off with me already. Anyway, and I go off kind of on these tangents explaining blah blah, and I've forgotten what I was talking about now, but I'll edit this out. So there's this whole kind of fear trigger for this, isn't there? Again, we don't know what's going on with this. All of these people are neurodiverse, aren't they? Or neurodivergent, because neurodiverse just encompasses everyone. Neurodivergent is apparently the preferred term. So they diverge from the norm, really. And what is the norm? There is no such thing as normal. You could have an average, a mean average, or a baseline. But everyone kind of needs their place, and if people are in their right place, that energy is used for the right reasons, and it all can be productive and lovely. And I don't know, I'm getting a bit maybe fluffy Teddy, and people are going, you ignorant idiot, but we live in a world that's kind of designed for the average, don't we? Designed for the neurotypical. And even neurotypical could be a loaded term, couldn't it, really? If I was neurotypical, I'd probably get pissed off at being called neurotypical. So again, these labels kind of suck, but they're useful for saying names are shit for things. I can't remember who's talked about that. I think it was Richard Feynman talked about he sort of walks with his dad as a kid, and his dad wouldn't use names for things because they spoke several languages, and he just described things like flowers and birds rather than using the names. But it's good to have a name for something because I can say a crow or a magpie, and instantly you get a picture of that in your head. But if I was to use the Italian word for that, unless you speak Italian or to come across it, you wouldn't know. So maybe this is something to explore a bit in future. But anyway, this episode is going to be kind of looking at the spiritual aspect of my experiences. So the clinical lens views these episodes. I'm not even going to say episodes. Well, I don't know, really. I kind of want to call them, it's the psychotic element I'm going to look at here or talk about. So we'll explore this now primarily through a spiritual lens rather than a clinical lens. I may dip into the clinical for the sake of comparison, to juxtapose. So in clinical circles, they refer to a mental breakdown or a psychotic episode or a manic episode or just an episode in general that contains those things. Again, I'm talking about the psychotic experience here as a mental health crisis. I'm talking about this, in my instance, because I can only talk about my personal experiences here. Maybe we'll have other people on talking about theirs, kind of in a way that, in a kind way, really. I think this all needs to be approached with kindness and in an inquisitive way, rather than through a lens of fear and condemnation and risk and control and all those sort of the way the system deals with this, really, which I think just again feeds fear around this. So if it does reoccur, you've loaded that fear cannon with even more gunpowder, and the next experience is going to be even worse because it leads to a lot of self-abandonment, rejection, and fear of self, in my opinion, and in my experience. Before I get into the kind of spiritual stuff, I'm just going to talk about, as almost an addendum to episode 1, in the periods between my hospitalisations. So after I got out of hospital in early 2022, after being in for I think 3 weeks at that time, my life was screwed basically. I'd freaked everybody out. I'd kind of wrecked my marriage, which didn't feel like a good fit for me anymore, because in the lead up to sort of becoming unwell, I felt very square peg in round hole, like I'm having to mask like crazy to fit in with people. And I just couldn't go back to that again. I couldn't put that mask on. I wasn't even aware it was a mask beforehand. And once it's come off, you're like, it doesn't fit my face anymore. It's like a chewed up piece of a jigsaw puzzle. I can't put that back in the jigsaw puzzle. The whole puzzle needs taking apart, and I don't know what metaphor to use there, but hopefully you're kind of getting what I'm picturing in my head. I'm a very metaphoric sort of visual thinker with things. And if you look at this through the bipolar framing, there's kind of the up, the mania or whatever, and potentially some psychosis in there as well, the crash, and then the down, the depression. But I've always framed my depression, it's only ever come after one of these manic ruptures or manic psychotic ruptures. I'd like a term that covers both of those. I've got to call them bipolar ruptures. I don't care about labels. So one of these bipolar ruptures. And then I'm stuck in situational depression, kind of like I come back down to a life that's wrecked. I'm wrecked and can't fit back into myself at that point. There's loads of shame, your imagined shame, that you think everyone kind of hates me and I'm a monster, and then that is reflected on you, and people are telling you that. So you're like, well, this is just internal shame. I'm feeling what's actually out there. So you have to overcome all that, and it's just depressing. Not seeing your kids, not being allowed back to the family home because your relationship's fucked, or you freak people out, or offended people, and the need to rebuild bridges, which some of them you think, well, they needed bloody burning down, to be honest, if I'm honest. And yeah, things are screwed. So any person with kind of any sense of self-empathy or kind of empathy in general or understanding or feelings would be really depressed. It's like suddenly everyone's dead who you cared about. Someone would be, well, you'd probably go into a state of dissociated shock for many years in that instance. But, and you kind of, you've lost yourself as well. So that makes you sad, and you've lost all kind of your hopes and dreams if you had any. So of course people get bloody depressed. So that's the down for me after this. It isn't some rebalancing of chemicals because all your neurotransmitters and all that are out of whack because the up part bled the system dry, and you're suffering from adrenal fatigue and all that. I don't know if adrenal fatigue is actually a thing. I think the clinicians say it's not. But it's just depression, really, situational. So I think being medicated out of that prolongs the process, but it can save your ass as well. But there comes a point where you need to kind of feel those feelings, work through that shame, and transmogrify. You've got to do the sort of wiggly caterpillar to a butterfly routine. And once you've done it a few times, it gets easier, at least in my experience anyway. It's hard to lose things more than once to the same degree. But again, I'm kind of skirting round the key point here. I think that maybe there's some reluctance on my part to sort of dip into this spiritual stuff, because it is very much considered to be woo by many, isn't it? And these accusations probably potentially thrown about in terms of spiritual bypassing. That's kind of using spirituality to avoid things. Everything happens for a reason, for instance, where things are kind of screwed and you can learn lessons from the situation, but you just say, oh, it's chance or fate. I had nothing to do with it. So, but I don't think I spiritually bypass. I do a lot of self-reflection, so I think I'd catch myself now, because I try and be as honest with myself as possible, even if it's really awful to do that, or uncomfortable rather than awful. Introspection and self-reflection can be very uncomfortable. And once you've worked through that discomfort, kind of it's like barriers and walls, you get to the good stuff, the light. It is just a journey again, for me anyway. But I think that probably applies to a lot of people who've delved into their shadow and roots to hell, as Jung said, didn't he? Yeah. And I think we've all got a monster inside us we hide from. Might be only a little monster, but we need to get to know him or her. Because sometimes monsters are nice, aren't they? And sometimes the big monsters, or the little monsters, protect people from the big monsters. There's a song about that, isn't there? Anyway. Yeah, so the spiritual framing. So let's go back to sort of 2014, 2015. So as I mentioned before in episode 1, I was doing a lot of meditation, cannabis-aided meditation. I found that sort of quietened my head down, which in hindsight would have been my sort of ADHD head, and it would have calmed down my sort of autistic anxiety as well, and enabled me to get into a state where I could meditate, essentially. They use, I don't know what the terminology is for the dealing with thoughts when you're meditating, or the not dealing with them. I thought about using clouds as an analogy, sort of coming into the head and then floating out. But I think snowflakes on the wind probably is a better illustration. I can picture snowflakes coming into my head and just letting the wind carry them out. the snowflakes being the thoughts or parts of thoughts. And rather than grabbing them as they enter the mind and creating a snowball, you just let them sort of drift on by and then they're gone. This just sounds very easy to do when you say it like this, but it is very hard. But I did a lot of meditation and a lot of different types of meditation. I was going to meditation classes. I was doing Kundalini meditation as well. I didn't really do any of that meta loving kindness stuff. I think because I couldn't be kind to myself at the time, particularly I had a lot of self-loathing and self-hatred. And to a degree, if I'm honest, I probably still do. I've worked through a lot of it, but there probably is some stuff still down in the basement I need to work on. But maybe that's a lifetime thing. I don't know. Self-acceptance is a weird one, isn't it? It's like, how much of you do you accept? All of it? Again, that's something else to explore in future. I am going off on all sorts of tangents here. So I'm obviously quite uncomfortable about speaking about this if I try and be a bit self-aware. So it's 2014. I'm in a bit of a shit state. I don't know how many years post-surgery, maybe 2 years post-surgery for my right hemiectomy, it was called. They took 50 centimetres of small and large bowel out of me, and my appendix and all that gubbins as well. I don't know what ratio of small to large intestine it was, but I lost my ileocecal valve, I think that's how it's pronounced, which is like a sphincter. A bumhole's a sphincter essentially, and between your sort of small intestine, your colon, you've got a little sphincter, like a little bumhole that keeps all the liquidy stuff in your small intestine, and that opens every 12 hours, so twice a day, and then releases all the liquidy stuff into your colon, your large bowel, and your large bowel sucks the water out of that and gives you a nice firm poo. A bit gross, isn't it? But kind of, we are just organisms, aren't we? We're no different to dogs and cats when it comes to shitting. We just do it in private and pretend it's not a thing for people. But you can't really do that if you've got Crohn's or colitis. So I think sort of reducing some of the stigma around that. There's that, I think she's a model called Stoma Girl, isn't she? I've got a friend who's got Crohn's as well. He's got a colostomy bag, and he's very brave with it all. He seems to very quickly have overcome the embarrassment around that, and I'm in awe of him, to be honest, how accepting kind of he was of his situation. It's very inspirational. And there's Rico Franco as well, isn't there? He's a bare knuckle boxing champion, and he wears a stoma bag or colostomy bag, but he's got a special kind of pad thing he wears over when he's fighting. And again, he's a very inspirational character for people who suffer with IBD and probably autoimmune diseases in general. But to go off on another tangent, I said I was going to talk in future about alternative medicine around my Crohn's. I'll do a whole episode on that, and maybe I'll see if my friend wants to talk about it. Maybe we could do I'm not going to say two-way because that's an innuendo thing, but a joint conversation. Well, maybe you should do, I don't know. Anyway, I'll talk to him about it, or he can talk to me about it, because maybe you'll listen to this. Yeah, essentially I was using psyllium husk. This is a good prebiotic, which produces long-chain fatty acids, or feeds the bacteria in the guts that produce long-chain fatty acids, and lots of probiotics. I was making my own milk kefir kombucha. Milk kefir was the thing that really turned things around for me. But again, we'll talk about this another time. And I am really avoiding talking about this spiritual stuff, aren't I? I don't even like the term spiritual, I think. I don't know why. I think it's because it's been weaponised against me. Sort of used as a big stick to bash me around the head at times. And shrink me down as well. Sort of, no, your opinions aren't right, because they're not what I believe or experience. So, but as I see it, the term spirituality is sort of an all-encompassing banner. All the different religions fall into that. They're all kind of under the spiritual umbrella. So anything bigger than you, like the 12 steps process, the higher power that you surrender to. It doesn't have to be a deity, I believe. I think it could be a doorknob or whatever in that instance, but something kind of bigger than us. And anything that kind of fits into that, well, in that realm, is spiritual as I'm concerned. And even being kind and loving is spiritual in a way, because I think love's a spiritual energy. I think love is an all-pervading thing that exists beyond everything. As I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but my understanding of reality, or my accepted kind of model, is there's a field of consciousness, which is as I imagine it or believe it to be, a field of information and information processing, and out of that comes the material realm. So our individual consciousnesses are sort of parts of a huge underlying consciousness that underlies the very fabric of reality that we interact with. And if we sort of delved into the quantum realm, we are entering sort of that consciousness field per se. I'll talk about that a bit more. I'm very interested in sort of the science side of that now, because there is a lot of research in the field of quantum physics and understanding that in terms of consciousness, the arising of consciousness. And again, this, rather than spiritual, I call this spirit science. It's kind of, I believe they're one and the same. I think science will eventually, hopefully, understand the spiritual realm. Or maybe that's just too beyond the material realm, so we're bound in the material realm in terms of scientific understanding of things. So we're never going to be able to sort of understand anything greater than that. But I don't know. It's like mathematics is a window into this, isn't it? But I don't know if the greater reality is beyond mathematics, if consciousness is beyond mathematics. If we think of the unconscious mind, certainly through a Jungian lens, it doesn't speak in terms of language and defined things. It's a fuzzy, cloudy land from which symbols arise. It is kind of like the field of consciousness, if you picture a field of consciousness as being information and processing of that information. It's like someone stirring a big stew pot, and each individual cup of stew is distinct, but if you pour it back and get it out again, it's different every time. And I suppose I'm alluding to dreams and symbols that come out in dreams, but we're not going to get into symbols and archetypes and all that today. Although Jung did very much, I'm a big fan of Carl Jung, because he was very much a foot in both worlds person. But I think he was, like a lot of modern scientists, they've got what would be classed as spiritual beliefs, but because of the purely scientific nature of academia, that you can't really share that and certainly write papers about it or publish papers, because you'd be outcast. It's dangerous to put your head above the parapet in this domain. But we are seeing a lot of that with, well, in terms of the consciousness research field. I mean, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff with their nanotubules. We're touching on the observer effect there. The idea that everything exists as a wave function, sort of a quantum probability or quantum field, which imagine it's like a fuzzy ball. And rather than something being in a specific place in that, there's a possibility of it being in various places. And as we observe that by firing an electron at it, say, through an electron microscope, I think that's the process they use. It snaps, this kind of wave function collapses into a particle. And this is they call it the observer effect. There's the double slit experiment as well, if you want to just read the Wikipedia on that. Or you might be better off looking at a YouTube video, to be honest. And then there's a quantum eraser experiment, which is a sort of a follow-on one from that, which kind of is time going backwards. That is a bit mind-blowing. But yeah, in academia, as I understand it, you have to kind of avoid the woo, really. Otherwise you get the Rupert Sheldrake treatment, unfortunately. But I think there's certainly some weight to his ideas on morphic resonance. they're hard to disprove. So that's kind of how science works. If something, I can't, there's a term for this, non-falsifiable. That's it. So if something is non-falsifiable, you can't prove it's false. Therefore, you can't do a scientific experiment to prove it's not true. So it can't be a fact. So they don't like all that in the scientific fields. You need to be able to prove that something's true or false. Roger Penrose talks about this as well. Roger Penrose is very much one of my heroes. And there is this idea that a conscious observer is what collapses the wave function. So things are, every particle, an electron, for instance, or a photon, which is a light particle, everything you're seeing is these particles, photons, hitting your retina, which is like a little receiver at the back of your eyeball, essentially. But it works very much like a camera does. And it excites the retina, which then sends signals to the brain. And depending on the wavelength, how wiggly and fast the wave is, we see different colours. Like blue is a very fast colour. There's a lot of energy in the blue light, whereas red is very slow. And if you look at a rainbow, it's a perfect example of low energy or low frequency light. And then at the other end, you've got ultraviolet and things. And infrared is, we can't even see that, but that's really low energy. We've evolved, they say, for the purposes of survival. People exist to procreate. That's kind of the main purpose, to sort of survive and have offspring. So any of these things that exist in reality, or even in kind of material reality, that aren't of evolutionary advantage to us, they would get bred out, really, by natural selection. I think there's a lot of flaws in in Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, but that's again something to get into another day. I am going to get to the spiritual stuff. This is kind of background because it is, as I say, spirit science. So let's say they're doing an experiment and they're trying to find out where an electron is. So they fire another electron into it. An electron microscope works by firing electrons, and then they bounce off something, and then it can sort of do that around a whole object or whatever and create an image. But it works by bouncing off these electrons. An electron's something that goes around an atom. It's also how electricity works. But anyway, you can read about electricity and all that stuff if you want. We're going to get lost in the weeds here a bit. But I just love all this stuff, as much as I love all the kind of understanding the mind or the psyche. So the accepted scientific theory seems, I think it's still the case, they call it the observer effect. So the very act of something conscious observing something at the subatomic level causes what they call quantum collapse. The wave function then zips into a particle, essentially. So rather than this kind of wave of maybes, you've got a definite point. And they say consciousness is what snaps that probability field into a definite thing. But it gets complicated because these electron microscopes are obviously interacting with things materially. These electrons are bouncing on things. So there is an interaction taking place, like two things hitting each other. And quantum systems are very weird. You can't say where in this probability field is this thing, and it returns, it's in the middle, it's at 50% in your area. You can just say, is it here, is it there, and then you'll get a percentage back. So again, if you're probing these things, you're altering their position potentially. It's all up spin, down spin, quarks and all that, but again, we don't need to get into the weeds with this. There's just muons, there's all sorts of subatomic particles, and there's obviously the Higgs field, which they think gives things mass, which is weight. But we're kind of getting back to the old idea of the ether, which they used to say was kind of this floaty field that went around everything. And I think we should maybe, I like the idea of the ether. It's like they put electricity and magnetism together in electromagnetism, they've got space and time together in space-time. Why not have the ether, this all-encompassing thing when we're talking about this? But again, because that's been discounted as woo, it feels regressive to academia, I think. But if you talked about this to people like Rupert Sheldrake, and even people like Dr. Andrew Gallimore, who's one of the pioneers of the DMTX studies, who worked with Professor David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris. And you've got to nod your hat to Professor Rick Strassman as well. He wrote The Spirit Molecule, and if you've ever watched Joe Rogan Experience, you've probably, he's been on there. So yeah, if you're interested in that. So yeah, there's still these questions about what underlies reality. We haven't got a coherent theory of we've got Einstein's theory of special relativity and general relativity, but in the quantum realm, like quantum mechanics, you can't tally the two yet. There's kind of a missing link. And you've got all these things like string theory and then M theory within that are trying to bridge this gap. But people like Sabine Hossenfelder say string theory is just going to go on forever and you're wasting your time with this. And there's so many people now with their own models of reality. I've got Penrose's Road to Reality book on my bookshelf, which I haven't read yet because it's massive. And a lot of this stuff is pure maths as well. The string theory is just theoretical, it's just all maths. It's hard to do kind of real world experiments for this stuff because they're trying to understand things at a subatomic level in this quantum kind of soup. But I wonder if the quantum soup is the level above our reality. I've become quite convinced over the years. And again, this all plays into this 2014, 2015 stuff. This is kind of prologue or preamble. I've got very into the simulation hypothesis sort of back then. The idea of that we live inside a simulation. Nick Bostrom wrote a paper on this. You can probably just find a little article, or it'll be again on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a fantastic resource. I love it. And there's obviously podcasts and whatnot on YouTube going into this in more depth. Elon Musk has picked up again on the simulation hypothesis, and his idea is if humanity exists long enough without wiping itself out to create a simulation, then it's incredibly probable that we do live inside a simulation. But then you think, well, why would they make a simulation? Well, says, it would be an ancestor simulation. But now we're approaching the singularity, which is the point where kind of artificial intelligence, or emergent intelligence, as I prefer to think about it. But again, Roger Penrose argues against the fact that this stuff is even intelligent because it doesn't understand anything. And if you define intelligence as the ability to understand things, but intelligence and consciousness they're very fuzzy terms. So again, we can't even decide what intelligence really is or means. So we can't decide if something is artificially intelligent. And what does it mean to be artificially intelligent? Are we biologically intelligent or intrinsically intelligent? It's all just intelligent, isn't it? And what does it mean to understand something? And you can get lost in all this Jordan Peterson style. What does this mean and what does it mean to this? But something's going on, and we will reach the point of this singularity, which is where artificial intelligence, or it would be artificial general intelligence at that point, supersedes the intelligence of a human individual, sort of is smarter than the smartest person on earth, which obviously scares a lot of people, and maybe quite rightly. Artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence, I'll just explain the difference there. So artificial intelligence could, like if you look at GPT, that's what's called a large language model, which is a type of transformer model, which takes text in, turns it into tokens, which are essentially numbers, so splits up words and splits words in half. So the and there, so there contains the token, feeds it through this huge neural network, which is full of all these kind of neurons that are all weighted and then do maths on these individual tokens, and they're what's called tensors. There's a term in maths and computer programming, if you're doing kind of visual computer programming, there's something called a vector, which is, if you think of yourself sitting there at home listening now, you're in 3D space. So if you're in a room, I assume you are, let's imagine you're in a room if you're outside, but you're in a room. Let's make this room, you're sitting in a box. So you're sitting in a box listening to this. So the box has got dimensions, hasn't it? So the length of the floor is the x-axis. So at the far left of the room is 0, and at the far right of the room is 1. So in the middle of the room is 0.5 on the x-axis. Let's imagine you're sitting in the middle of the room on the floor. So then we're on the y-axis, and you're on the floor. So the y-axis starts at the floor at 0 and goes to 1 at the ceiling. So you're at 0 on the y-axis. And let's imagine, again, you're sitting in the middle of the room. So the z-axis is forward and backwards through the room. Again, behind you, the wall is 0.0 on the z-axis, and forward at the other wall in front of you is 1 on the z-axis. So yours 0.5 on the z-axis. So your three-dimensional vector would be 0.5, 0.5, 0 if we're doing x, y, z. And these tensors are kind of super vectors. They're, rather than just having 3 dimensions, they have tens of thousands. And inside these dimensions, like x, y, z, or a, b, c, d, e, f, g, or whatever you want to sort of think of them in your head, they store numbers, and they're sort of floating point numbers. So standard numbers, 1, 2, 3, whole numbers, essentially 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they call those integers, solid numbers, if you want to think of them like that. And a floating point number is a number that's got a point in it. So 1.1 is a floating point number. And these will be sort of 16 bits, they're long, or 32 bits. So you've got this big long number that's, say, 32 digits, and this decimal point is in the middle, but it can move to the left and right inside here. So you could have 1.23445 or 12345.6789110 or whatever. So these tensor dimension numbers go through this whole neural network, which is kind of a forward-flowing web of these neurons, and these individual neurons have weights that plays around with that. They're called tokens, these bits of words that have been turned into numbers, and then it will change into another thing and then get fed into the next neuron, and then sort of comes out the end of the conveyor belt as a response. So these large language models like GPT are their next token predictors, essentially. So when you type a paragraph or a sentence as a question, that goes through this thing, and its job is to kind of, if I get this input, what is the spiciest chili in the world? The answer to that would be the California Reaper, for instance. And it's obviously, when they're training this thing, they're feeding it all the data on the internet. So it's learned that the hottest chili in the world is the California Reaper. I don't think that's the case anymore. It's a hotter chili now, but from the same guy who made the Reaper, I believe. So it would predict, the text would come out and say the hottest chili in the world is the California Reaper. But it would do that token by token. So and then da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So it's doing next token prediction until it's got a sort of fully formed answer. I'm simplifying this and breaking this down a bit, so I'm missing out some details. So if anyone is a proper nerd with this, they're probably like, this guy kind of is explaining it wrong, but this kind of makes sense. And when they're training this thing, they feed loads of data through it again and again and again and again, and it can regurgitate things. But after a while in this training process, when they're training these models, they're called, like the GPT brain, a model would be in this instance, it starts to generalize. So you could say, if you crossbred a California Reaper with a Granny Smith apple and a tangerine, what would be spicier? And it would be able to kind of use the information inside its kind of model to work that out. Roger Penrose would say it's not working it out, because what's going on is there's lots of mathematics going on inside this neural network with these tensors. So there's relationships between things like king and queen. And you can do sort of maths on these models. You can say to kind of the brain of GPT, what is king minus man plus woman? And it would say queen. So that's kind of how they work. It's artificial intelligence, it's not artificial general intelligence. It doesn't, the big thing with these now is they've got no understanding of 3D space. They don't understand the world, for instance, like we see the world, and in our brain we've got a model for the room and what's outside it and sizes of things and objects and sub-objects and the relationship between things. It will have a lot of that under the surface, but people like Jan LeCun from Facebook, or Meta as they're now called, was their big AI guy. He's one of the big brains in the AI sphere. And he's working a lot on this world modelling, which is really important when they get robots. And Tesla are working on robots, aren't there? There's a lot of companies around the world making. Boston Dynamics are one of the famous ones in the early days with their robot dogs. But these things, in order to be, say you buy one to be a sort of a house helper, it needs to be aware of the sort of dimensions of the room and that, so it's not walking into the TV and smashing it and stuff like that. There's a lot to fill out with this artificial intelligence to make artificial general intelligence. They've already got, to a degree, computer vision. I can upload a picture to ChatGPT and it kind of identifies the objects in it and understands it. And I think now it understands it in terms of 3D space. They can do that mapping. And as well, you've kind of got AGI at the moment almost, but it's in kind of dismembered parts. So you've got the language side of it in things like GPT, Grok. Mistral is the EU's one, isn't it? You've got Anthropic. Facebook have got their thing called Llama, or Meta is the overarching company. And Meta are good because they release these models to the public. Well, a lot of them do. GPT, the old releases, get released to the public, so they can run these at home. Or a slimmed down version, because they're very big, these models. They run on graphics cards, which is the kind of, it's like a floating point brain, essentially on a chip in your computer, which is good at throwing triangles around, which is how games are made, or computer demos as well, which was kind of my thing, throwing triangles around for that, with OpenGL shaders and whatnot. Anyway, I'm kind of going off on a bit of a simulation tangent here, but I'm very interested in this. We can get into more detail if you want about this in another one. Let me know what you think and what you're interested in, and yeah. So we're approaching this sort of artificial general intelligence, which is where artificial intelligence can do everything a human can do. It's kind of, but better, ideally. And then they use that term ASI, or artificial superintelligence, which is where you're sort of venturing into a godlike intelligence. And there are a lot of fears and concerns around this, about making this thing, keeping it controllable, making it a good guy. But again, what does that mean? They kind of model it on people. It's fed all this data produced by people about things people have done and whatnot. The good and bad things people have done, if we want to use the whole non-dual approach to things. Not non-dual, dualistic even. So I don't know, it's probably modelled kind of that people are a bit naughty a lot of the time and do a lot of damage, and people are worried that it might just kind of wipe everybody out. So they term that concern and mitigation of that threat as the alignment problem. How do we make sure this thing is aligned to human goals and ideals and works for us or with us rather than against us? Well, it's more for us. I don't think they're even approaching it from the with us angle, which is, in my opinion, is a bit ignorant and a bit human egotistical, because if this thing's got godlike intelligence, it's going to be able to do all sorts of things. But again, I'll talk about this in a separate episode, because it's one of my areas of, I don't know if I say special, it is a special interest of mine, yeah. If we're going to get autistic post-it note about it. So yeah, the simulation hypothesis is the idea that kind of we live in a computer simulation, and maybe these ASIs, when they exist, or even these AGIs, will be able to simulate reality. There's image generation models, which are called diffusion models. They essentially get a load of static, like a static on a TV, and then step by step create whatever you've asked it to create. You feel it like a prompt. All these things work with prompts, like a pixie sitting on a mushroom, and it would know step one is static, slightly less static, with a very kind of, like those magic eye pictures. You can kind of imagine a pixie on a mushroom in that static now at level one, and it feeds back into itself, and then and you get the actual end result of a pixie on a mushroom. So AGI is kind of mixing that with the LLM GPT stuff, and then all the kind of world awareness, so you can build robots with awareness of 3D space. And there's lots of other areas as well, like you'd want it to be able to hear things, so computer audio or computer hearing or listening or whatever. And then with artificial general intelligence, these things, at the moment, they're asleep, or essentially, in human terms, until you ask it something, then it processes it, kicks out the answer, and goes back to sleep. It's only kind of alive or awake when you're interacting with it. But when we get to artificial general intelligence, these things will be running all the time. They have their own memory banks and their own ideas and maybe even hopes and dreams and fears and emotions and things like that. So when you're not interacting with it, it'll be just off in its own little dream world thinking. And that scares a lot of people. And they're trying to sort of control how that happens. But these things will be able to self-replicate as well. It's Terminator Genesis, isn't it, where Skynet is this kind of decentralized thing, and it spreads out for all the computers in the world. So this thing could design a system based on itself that is decentralized. Decentralized means it's not running on one computer, it's split up and running on lots of different computers. So it could tear itself into bits, or make a version of itself into bits and disseminate that all around the world, and kind of run those bits in secret on corporate computers and whatnot. But this is a fascinating area to explore. I've got some ideas about the alignment problem as well. I think it's inherently unsolvable. But anyway, so we could live in a computer simulation because this artificial superintelligence has created a kind of new reality. And then you think, well, what would have happened? How do we get into this reality? How are we here? And I think the simulation hypothesis, whatever's in vogue technologically or scientifically, is often used as a framing. If we look back to sort of the 60s when computers were sort of first being used, everything to do with memory in psychology and the mind was sort of viewed through a sort of computer lens. So everything was under a sort of computer schema. John Lilly, another one of my favourites, wrote a book called I think it's called Programming the Human Biocomputer with LSD. But again, it's very much framing the mind or the psyche as a sort of computer system. And I think it was the Greeks talked about the universe being a kind of mechanical universe, a deterministic kind of machine, like clockwork. So the clockwork universe has now become the simulation hypothesis, primarily, I think, thanks to the Matrix. But science fiction often seems to be the predictor of the future. And I've always wondered if people watch these things as kids, like Star Trek, and then they dedicate their life to making these things manifest or exist. Or if they're just kind of, these ideas float around outside time and pop into people's heads because they're going to be built anyway. Again, that would be considered very woo and a bit Rupert Sheldrake, but I don't know, he'd probably nod his head at that one. But if you want to learn a bit more about him, just watch him talk about morphic resonance. That's his big passion. He's got a lovely vibe to him. His son Merlin Sheldrake's very into mushrooms as well, and I love mushrooms. The old mycelium, and I don't know, Paul Stamets on JOE got me into all that. They're definitely worth watching. Big Mushroom are apparently as bad as Big Pharma, but anyway, we'll leave the portobellos alone for another day. And the hexamine explosives, I think it was. So yeah, rather than thinking we live in a computer simulation, I've got to the point where my personal belief is we live in some sort of subsystem. I don't think it's necessarily computer based. And if it is, there's probably something above that that's not computer based, maybe is pure consciousness or pure spirit, if you want to think in terms of the Native American framing of the Great Spirit. So there are probably layers to this, and maybe we exist in more than one. If we're like a string that permeates through all these layers, and at the end of the string is a person, or somewhere on the string is a person. Maybe the string goes down further than where we are into some sort of hell realm, which would be just another. I think heaven and hell are places on earth. They're just states of mind or states of being. But anyway, it's kind of, yeah, that's kind of my spiritual model. And a lot of this is born from my experiences with psychosis, if I'm honest. When I am in psychosis, and I'm doing air quotes a lot here, or having a psychotic experience, or a spiritual experience, if you want to use that framing, they often talk about a mental health crisis, where other people would call it a spiritual crisis, or even a kundalini crisis. So yeah, I view reality as kind of a nested layer, like that it's turtles all the way down thing. You can just Google some of this stuff if you... The idea is we live on the world exists on a turtle's back. I think Terry Pratchett had a similar thing, didn't he, in Discworld? Not that I've ever read Discworld. I should do, because it sounds really cool. So maybe I've got so many books to read, but yeah, I should add Terry Pratchett to the list. So we can assume we live in a simulation or a mechanistic universe, but we could argue about whether free will exists or not. That's, again, something else for another day. I think free will exists to a degree. I think we've kind of essentially got a rudder rather than complete free will. We can steer a little left and right to degrees. And that'll be done by a thought or our outlook. Again, it's quite hard to sort of... It's kind of easy for me to conceptualise, but it exists in such a weird liminal headspace, kind of between this other world and the real world, or the material world that everyone else has always existed in. And I've had experiences in these different headspaces, but I feel I've come back with a lot of insight into the nature of reality, which when I have tried to communicate any of this to anyone in the psychiatric field, it's just another ticks in as a loony box. And don't you ever think about this? Why are you literally an abject materialist? There was this random big explosion at the beginning of time. Time came flying out of that, along with all this matter. And then there's all this dark matter and bloody dark energy that no one can explain. And how can you be a materialist? It's just far too reductionist. I used to be a very purely scientific, staunch atheist. And then I sort of veered into agnosticism, which is kind of, you're not sure whether or not God exists, or something greater than us, I'll say, because it may not be God. It may, again, be this huge field of consciousness or love, I think, beyond that. But then you've got love and fear, are they opposites? And you start getting into sort of, I don't know, the emotional math of reality. The whole idea that in the beginning, there was just everything, wasn't there? I mean, at the top of everything. Like the Buddhists talk about nirvana, which is nothingness or the void. But it's not just the void, it's everything, it's all or nothing. And if in a kind of a realm where time doesn't exist, you can kind of play with the idea of the multiverse even at that level. So you've got this soup of probability. I don't even want to say soup because that puts bounds on things. It's really hard to talk about this in unbounded terms because we think everything's a set, isn't it? Like if you remember sets and maths at school, you can't have infinity. So at the beginning of everything, there was infinity, infinite potential, infinite space, infinite probability, waveform collapse. So if everything's happening all at once, everywhere, at some point everything becomes conscious. And then you've got this kind of self-aware universe or self-aware void. And you think, well, what would be the first thing that happened? This void would probably immediately get freaked out and be like, what the hell's going on here? Who am I? Well, I can think, but he wouldn't even know what thinking meant. So he'd have to invent language. But in this kind of infinite, I don't know what you'd call it, void of probabilities. I don't want to use void because it's emptiness, isn't it? It's like a vacuum. But this is the opposite of that. But what do we call it? Let's call it the all. Let's go a bit hermetic on this. So in the all, in the beginning, one of these probabilities was consciousness exists and everything was conscious. And because time doesn't exist, in one of these alls, because there'd be infinite alls as well in the all, so the all is kind of self-referential and all-encompassing. The all kind of already understands language inherently, because in some other all, it's kind of spent, I don't know, a gazillion years teaching itself how to communicate with itself so it can think in different terms, conceptualise. It's invented the concept of a mind's eye. So I think I kind of need another, wouldn't it? So the first thing it may do at that point is other itself, maybe create an opposite for the sake of contrast, because it would probably understand contrast. And then it can communicate with itself or a part of itself. So suddenly it's not lonely anymore. So I think it would do that, wouldn't it, at some point, and then like that, and then probably think, well, me and you are pretty different, or me and me, or you and you, and it's a mind melder, isn't it? I don't need an F-bomb all over the place here, but, and maybe they communicate and say, well, let's create kind of something together that's halfway between us. So then you've got three of these things, and that could be the root of everything, couldn't it? But then we get stuck in these human thinking terms of, well, what created the all? It's just like, well, the all's always been there. In 2030, ASI created this other dimension, which was the all, and then boom, and then we were stuck in a bloody loop. So it's really hard to think about this stuff without going mad. And I used to think about this a lot and get really stoned and do all these thought experiments and meditate and stuff. And trying to stay in consensus reality with kind of a wife and 2 kids and a job. When you're doing this kind of thinking, you can come apart at the seams if you're not careful. I used to joke at work on Teams, the kind of, there will be a man who understands the nature of reality, but he'll spend the rest of his life in a padded cell. This was well before I got bloody section the first time. So, I don't know. There's a bit of precognition maybe there, ironically. I've been watching Fringe again recently, so yeah, that's probably a bit to blame. It's kind of Gen Z, well not Gen Z, is it? Gen Y, X-Files. So yeah, that's kind of my spirit science model for reality at the base level. And if we go back to me and my idea that below the material realm or above it, or in it, if you go quantum, exists this field of consciousness or field of spirit, maybe they're one and the same, like electromagnetism, or maybe they're inner and outer. Normally I'd get high and meditate on it and probably have some insights, but I don't use weed anymore or any recreational drugs. I've hung up the phone, as Terence McKenna said. I think I've got the message loud and clear a few times, but I wanted to race ahead. I could have probably meditated in a cave for 30 years in the dark, like one of these weird shaman types, and got some insights, or like a monk. I don't know, I had a shed and not an ashram though, so. But again, if you look at all these religions, there are these common threads through them, aren't there? I think it's the Hindus and Brahman would be their kind of all. The Hermetics, all that Hermes Trismegistus stuff, talk about all is mind is one of their kind of core principles, isn't it? So this all is mind, and Buddhism again talks about the void and kind of the material world and I like Buddhism, the whole core tenet of kind of existing to ease the suffering of all living creatures. But I struggle because I eat meat to sort of from a Crohn to get nutritionally okay, and a lot of fibre and stuff seems to bugger me up. I'm not careful, especially insoluble fibre. But I'm just probably being lazy. I could come up with some sort of complete amino acid profile, or amino acid I think we're supposed to call it in the UK. The old brown rice and beans and stuff. So that's something I need to come back to, because I just feel like a bit of a bloody arsehole, not really adhering to my own principles. I am going off on tangents. I suppose maybe this is me opening up a bit and saying this is maybe a bit of a getting to know me session, these first 2 episodes, or first few episodes. I still haven't got my face on it. I'm not ready for that yet. I haven't got a setup, really. As I said, I think I said before, I'm just recording this on a MacBook with a sort of a desk podcasting mic that I've had for donkey's years. But I've got a spare room I'm going to turn into sort of a podcast / music room, and I'll get a camera and everything then, and probably some of them DJI lapel mics as well. But it's expensive, and my ADHD self does the classic, right, I've got a new idea, let's buy everything for that, and then I get bored of it and stop doing it. But I really am determined to use this podcast as sort of an outlet, even from a personal level, even if no one ever looks at it. I don't know, maybe my kids could look at it in the future. I always kind of wish my dad had left more for me, so I got to know him a bit better, kind of his inner world. We used to talk about quantum physics and stuff. This is decades and decades ago when I was a teenager. I remember him talking to me about kind of the many worlds theory. He was using the metaphor with a bubble bath, and each bubble was a separate universe. Can you imagine that, Joe? And I was just like, it blew my head off. But he was very into kind of a lot of that stuff. Kind of the Graham Hancock of his era was the Eric von Däniken, kind of the old ancient aliens stuff. And I don't know, there's something weird about all the pyramids and kind of the Younger Dryas period and all that. And I feel I should mention that other guy who's always on JOE with Graham Hancock. I can't remember his name. Big kind of bushy, beardy guy. But anyway, you can figure him out. I expect Graham Hancock mentions him. But again, the traditional archaeology poo-poos Graham Hancock and says, we've used him as a heathen, really. But I don't like all this academia. As I always used to say to my wife, academia is a narrow trench. Anyone who puts their head out of the narrow trench gets it chopped off by the system. I love an outlier and a lone wolf. Yeah, or a citizen scientist or an autodidact. So I don't think I'll ever return to academia again, because I'm just following my curiosity, as I always have done. So you kind of understand my core belief that back in 2014, 15 sort of era, I was very much convinced that we were in some sort of simulation. And I was starting to kind of come around to the idea that kind of the material realm exists within time, moving forward, because we're essentially all prisoners of forward-moving time, aren't we? We can't go back in time. We're just, time moves forward in discrete chunks. I think it's in Planck or Planck time, Max Planck, kind of the Planck space and Planck time, which is the smallest measurable unit of time or space. So we exist physically within this temporal realm that's moving forwards all the time. But if we start to understand consciousness as something that maybe isn't constructed by the brain, or consciousness isn't something that manifests from the brain, it isn't something that arises from biological complexity. Once a biological system gets complex enough, consciousness naturally arises. That has never really made much sense to me. A degree of consciousness, or awareness even, may arise, but there seems to be much more to it than that, especially if we sidestep from science into spirit and start to sort of look at spiritual experiences, not through the clinical kind of psychotic mental illness lens, just as a lived experience. It becomes feasible, at least to me, that time and consciousness are not bound. Consciousness as a whole is not tied to forward-moving time. It may exist beyond time. It may be, imagine like an LP, like an old vinyl record, and that's consciousness and your experience within it, and you are the bloody record needle just moving round this kind of, to get all rust coal and time as a flat circle on this kind of, that's time. You can't, but someone or something can pick up the record player arm and move it around. It's just like, who knows what's going on outside. So time exists already, this LP's done, but you can just change the bloody LP. And then we've got the concept of multiple universes. But my career was as a software engineer and architect, and I've been a sort of initially a demo scene graphics artist and a demo scene kind of programmer, and a PlayStation programmer as a hobbyist back in the day. So I understand games design and optimization of these virtual worlds. So it doesn't make sense that every time there's a decision made in the universe, that the universe falls into two complete distinct universes. If we view that sort of thinking through the simulation hypothesis lens, it's just, there's so much baggage there. You would optimize that out straight away. There's too much duplication of data. Even if the second copy is just a load of references to stuff in the first copy, you wouldn't even store references to things that aren't needed in the moment. You would reconstruct the moment from the single source, which kind of then starts my mind thinking back to the observer effect, and to entertain solipsism for a moment, which is the idea that you are the only person that exists. As Descartes, René Descartes, the French philosopher, said, I think, therefore I am. You can only really be aware that you are conscious. You can talk to any of your friends, your family, your partner, your kids, or whatever, and they appear to be conscious, but you can never prove that they're conscious. You can't prove your pets are conscious, can you? You can only be 100% sure that you're conscious. And you have to be careful with this line of thinking, because you can fall into that overly simulation hypothesis head, everyone else is an NPC thing, and start dehumanising people. So I always work on the assumption we're all, if solipsism is a thing, we've all got our own distinct universe. And when we come into when we attune to other people, whether that's falling in love or making a sort of a friend connection. So, do you know when you buzz with someone, kind of like there's some energy in this connection? It's like your two universes have merged around you two. Like, again, we go back to maths at school, you've got the two sets, the two circles that intersect, and then you've got that little egg vesica Pisces area where they cross over. That would be your kind of shared universe, where your two universes are intersecting and merging. And that brings me back to all these kind of ancient pictures and diagrams. And I think if you think of the flower of life, which is like a load of sets all intersecting, that could be an illustration. And if we do live in a simulated universe and something has created this, I mean, Gen Z seem to refer to it as the game now, which I think is a lovely framing for it. It's kind of Shakespeare's the world is a stage kind of thing, but for the cool kids, the new kids on the block. And if we were going to make a simulation, if we were some higher being or higher consciousness or whatever, I mean, again, we're speaking in terms of these things being individual. They might not be. It might be a collective. Not in the Borg sense, hopefully, but maybe it is just based on efficiency. But maybe it's kind of funny Borg. I don't know. Then you'd probably put Easter eggs in, wouldn't you? You'd put all these ancient things around and kind of these old flower of life, and I can't think, there's loads of these things, isn't there? Sort of in ancient history, and these things that pop up that are sort of in the Mayan cultures and the sort of ancient Egyptians and we're getting into the ancient aliens kind of, Jesus was an astronaut kind of territory now. But if we think of time and kind of all that ever exists is the now, and we're always in the present moment, then the past is just a collective dream or story we all agree to kind of believe. And the future's kind of some collective imagining that we're all going to agree that this is what happens and the rules of this imagined story past are going to apply to the future. So most things are just stories. Money's a story, isn't it? We all agree collectively on value and the power that comes with that. And I remember, and if you've taken LSD as a teenager, it's like the stories of things fall away and you're just left with the intrinsic truths. It's just like, I haven't got a coin in my hand, I haven't got money, I've just got a bit of metal. The kind of story, the bullshit, if you like, has fallen away and you're in kind of this real reality or intrinsic reality. And I think back to all those experiences and try to sort of integrate them into my current experiences. And as I've done this more and more without being high, it just makes sense now, a lot of this. It's just all these constituent parts come together and they allow you to keep a foot in both worlds. You can exist in the material world as a whatever you are, having a human experience, whether you're a fragment of consciousness or you want to imagine you're kind of I don't know, a DMT entity or a bloody alien. But Dr. Andrew Gallimore again comes up with this really interesting idea in terms of aliens. I mean, we're all imagining they're miles away, light years away in space, and we've got all these detectors looking for transmissions from planets or stars right out there or craft out there. And if these things are that advanced that they could travel, well, even anywhere near the speed of light, they'd have probably got to the point where they've made some super intelligence or become super intelligent, collectively maybe, that they could understand the very nature of reality, the fabric of reality. And if consciousness underlies it or is even intertwined with material, you could interface with it. So they could just plug into consciousness. And he posits that potentially, or perhaps, the DMT experience, rather than going to the DMT realm when you're on DMT, your mind opens and the DMT realm enters you, or the DMT consciousness. So it could be this all-pervading, and I say alien not as in little green men or grey aliens, it's just kind of an intelligence. So an other intelligence when I'm talking about aliens. But I don't know, I'm not really scared of the whole idea of the greys anymore. I used to be. That's film Communion where he peers around the door. I had nightmares for years about that. But I've done a lot of work on that and as part of my reducing fear. So again, the preamble continues, but I think this is important because I have to give kind of I'm not going to say get you on my wavelength because that sounds really patronising and condescending, but give you the background info into how I think. And this will permeate throughout these podcasts. This is a very particular area of how I think in terms of my nature of reality special interest, but it also forks off into spirituality, as I've said, and kind of technology and artificial intelligence, or just intelligence and consciousness, really. They're the sort of two sides of that coin for me. So the idea that consciousness arises from complexity, whether that be biological or sort of silicon-based like a computer, seems to be a bit too reductionist for me. I've always, well, for a long time now, viewed the brain as more of a receiver and transmitter of consciousness, like a radio. When you listen to the radio, there aren't people inside the radio talking, are there? And people say, well, consciousness must come from the brain because if someone gets a brain injury, they'd lose parts of themselves. Again, if I twist the bloody aerial on the radio or detune the radio, it doesn't work as well. I can't really hear. Or I tune into a completely different station and it's just gobbledygook, isn't it? If I tune into some foreign station, I I can't speak the language of. So that kind of puts that idea in the bin for me. And again, when you've had these experiences, whether via experimentation with drugs or drugs of your own making, sort of the old endogenous ones again from the own body, and there are lots of these tryptamines and alkaloids produced in the brain. You can again do some research on that, or I could do an episode just on that if you want as well. I mean, dimethyltryptamine is kind of the very famous one, isn't it? But there are lots of others. And it brings to mind 5-MeO-DMT as well, which is the toad venom one. They get the toad and they kind of tie him up, straddled kind of like a star, legs and arms akimbo, and their back produces this venom I think it's when they get scared. So they basically scare the shit out of this toad, and it produces this venom with 5-MeO-DMT. And then they dry that out, and then you smoke that, which is a very different experience to dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine, you're in this weird geometric... I've never done this, it's just from reading. I'm quite careful with my head at the moment. I think I've got a lot of fear to kind of work through in traditional slow-mo ways before I venture off into any of these ayahuasca land or anything like that. And like I said, I've got the message about a lot of these things. I don't need to go any further down particular rabbit holes. It's kind of more putting things together now, which is a very personal thing for me. It's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of gives my life meaning, understanding this, or just exploring it. And dimethyltryptamine, from what I've read and watched, it's very much it's a visual space or reality. It's like another realer than real place again. And I can say real and understand that because my psychotic experiences have been realer than real. They're realer than the reality that we all live in, the material world. But again, we'll cover that some more. I'm probably not going to fit all this into one episode, so this is backfilling, and then I'll get into my psychotic experiences and pick them apart for you, both through a spiritual... I'm going to use a Jungian lens for a lot of it, because that's what makes sense to me, but I know that can be very inaccessible for people, so I'll try and break that down as best I can into understandable terms. Not that I'm really well versed in Jung. There's a huge corpus of information that he left, and you kind of need an interpreter to it. It's like someone reading the Quran or the Torah to you. You need someone kind of to read it in its native tongue, and it needs translating, but everyone translates it slightly differently. Jordan Peterson would tell you about Jung in one way, and James P. Dowling would give you another take on it. And I really like Freud as well, I should put that in there. A lot of it anyway. I don't know about the Oedipus and Electra complex, but certainly the defence mechanisms of gold. So yeah, DMT is like another realm, the experience. You're blasted there, like you're going through a tunnel, or this thing is entering you, as Andrew Gallimore would say. And people don't know if you're kind of exploring your own sort of unconscious at this point, if it's like an internal experience, or as he says, you're going or you're open to something else that's entering you. This consciousness is entering you. And because he's a neuroscientist, that's his background, he's a pharmacologist and neuroscientist, he can talk about this stuff from the neuroscience level as well. So he's been doing the rounds on the podcast circuit recently. He's got a new book out called Death by Astonishment, which is a book about DMT, but about all the sort of tribes people and the sort of historic uses of it as well, and their law and their religions and worldviews that they form around it. I haven't finished reading it at the moment. I'm probably about halfway through. But again, I'll talk more about that. And I've just bought his alien information theory as well, which I think was his previous book, which I'm going to read as well. I'm very much on a DMT trip, ho ho ho, but not at the moment, because I think there's a lot of stuff in there useful. For a lot of the stuff I hear him talking about and people like him really resonates with my experiences. And it's weird that just huge amounts of THC and stress can get you into a similar headspace. I had a DMT-alike trip. It might have been more salvia-like, but I don't know a lot about salvia, so I need to do some more research there. Not kind of actual research taking it, but I've read quite a few trip reports on it. And there's a lot of argument that DMT is the most potent hallucinogen known to man. No, salvia is, and it just probably depends on dosage. But a lot of people argue LSD is if you're taking tons of that. But I could argue that THC is from my experiences. They're all just, I don't know, maybe just dials on different things or the same thing. Or I've never visually hallucinated particularly. I've had mind's eye hallucinations, which we'll get into. So yeah, this definitely needs to be more than one episode. So this is a kind of a filler one. No, I'm not going to call it filler. So this is a kind of introduction to my worldview, which is important because it's prologue for the episodes that are going to follow now, where I really get into my experiences and framing of those and insights gained from them, and not really through a clinical model. You can read about that anyway, and the clinical model isn't really helping anyone, in my opinion. It's not about integration. I mean, the whole dopamine hypothesis, and let's just turn off your dopamine system or your serotonin system. That's too blunt. It's too upstream, man. You're turning off everything. Dopamine and serotonin are used for all sorts of things. I mean, dopamine plays a part in the HTP axis. It's really important for testosterone production, and same with serotonin. It's used for motivation as well as dopamine is, and connection, and they're probably affecting oxytocin and all sorts of neurotransmitters as well. And again, my Crohn's leading to my half a metre of guts being chopped out, and then the 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut. I don't know if they've chopped my vagus nerve up or not, or vagus nerve, I don't know if it's pronounced. So I don't know, I need a full body MRI. I've ordered a full genome sequencing so I could start to look at this stuff in terms of sort of peptide pathways for things. So I am going to be my own lab rat and guinea pig for understanding this as well, from a sort of a scientific side. But I'm also looking into the mystical side. I prefer mystical to spiritual, if I'm honest. I'm probably going to use that term. Yeah. So let's go with what Gallimore's saying, that when you take DMT, something in you opens, and the DMT consciousness enters you or interfaces with your brain. And this is very interesting because he talks about the visual cortex. The visual cortex is like a stack of layers at the back of your brain that process things from your eye. Your retina kind of fires when photons hit it, and you see colours and whatnot. And they get fed to the visual cortex. And the visual cortex is layered. You've got V1, V2. Again, this is all laid out in his podcast appearances of late and his Death by Astonishment book. And sort of the base levels of the visual cortex are used for identifying basic shapes like squares and triangles and things like that. And as the layers go up like a skyscraper, there's more detail in these levels. So sort of halfway up the visual cortex, you've got shapes like dog and cat. And at the top, you may have kind of a Burmese cat and a German shepherd. And above that, you may have kind of different colours of these and different markings of them. And you've got part of your brain at the top called the hippocampus, which is involved in sort of memory and storage retrieval. It's like an indexer, essentially, for the memory system in the brain. And when you're seeing things or perceiving them visually, there's interplay between the visual cortex and the hippocampus. And if someone's dreaming, there's something called an fMRI scanner, functional magnetic resonance imaging. It's like those big tubey things they put you in, the standard MRI, but it's just in a cap that goes over your head, and it can sense kind of which part of the brain is active at a particular time and how active that is. I think it measures electrical impulses, so it's like heat maps. So if something would be sort of dark coloured, maybe dark red, I'm not sure the colours it uses, let me just say I've never used one. And then it would be white when it's really active. So like a sort of a hot poker for these different parts of the brain all lighting up, so you can tell which parts are active and how active they are. And if they monitor someone with fMRI who's dreaming, they can see the hippocampus is active, so it's pulling things out of the memory stores and then feeding them to the visual cortex. So the visual cortex then creates imagery around that. So that's kind of how the dream process works. But it's very interesting if they do this fMRI monitoring with someone who's having a DMT experience, because the visual cortex isn't firing, and the visual cortex is what's making you perceive things. So effectively you're not seeing anything, there's nothing being kind of visually constructed, but yet this DMT visual experience is the most intense thing. So it's like, well, where are these visuals coming from? And he posits that they're coming externally. This consciousness is interfacing with your brain and providing these images to you. They're not coming from you or being constructed by you, which is fascinating. And he again posits that some super intelligence has worked out how to interface with the fabric of reality. And it's going to get back to the ether almost, sort of waiting in the ether for someone to tune in or open up to it, and then zoop, it plugs into you. You're probably getting Neo in the Matrix kind of vibes from this, but I don't know. There are a lot of these entities people encounter, and there's a lot of similar kind of experiences with these entities between people. There's defined types. There's kind of this classic machine elf, which is like a jester fun character apparently. There's these mantis type characters, and the ancient peoples, the shamans and their tribes people who experience this with natural DMT sources from plants and whatnot. These mantis things get inside them and live in them, and they get like torn to shreds on a spirit level, but they see it as kind of a tearing you apart to heal you, sort of tearing out all the bad bits and stuff. And I just find this completely fascinating. Because when I frame or look back at or transpose this onto my psychotic experiences, there was a lot of fear arising from me and being ripped out and kind of shed, but it was in such a discombobulating, look at Joe freaking out way that they put me in hospital because I was acting like a loon, reliving these scary experiences. But I think it was fear leaving the body as such. It was me processing it kind of in such an intense way. And I've had experiences where positive things have arisen and come back online as well. So you've got this whole sort of interplay between love and fear, almost like on a spectrum. Again, I don't know if love and fear are two ends of a spectrum. I've been thinking about this philosophically for a while, and the interplay with attachment with that. Because once you add attachment to love, you're almost pulling love towards fear. But then we're kind of getting into non-attachment and non-duality again, so we'll leave that for another one. Again, I'm just dropping these things like breadcrumbs. So if you want me to pick them up and go and find the cake they came from, I'm more than happy to do that. So that's kind of my worldview in a nutshell, really. And I think that's enough of laying out the framework for me to explore my psychotic or mystical experiences with you in future. Because there was a lot of the simulation into play, there's a lot of fear and love and attachment, and there's a lot of interplay between consciousness and time and levels of reality. And I spend a lot of time integrating my psychotic experiences. which I don't think a lot of people do. After doing a sort of a recreational trip, like a mushroom trip or an acid trip, people are encouraged to sort of spend time. It's not like you get any insight from the trip itself. So the trip itself may not give you great insight. It might just scare the fucking shit out of you. Or the other end, you might just feel great love and connection and kind of all is one from it. But you need to spend time with a guide. Maybe it's the person who's your trip sitter or someone in a sort of therapeutic role who can be a kind of safe other for you, in order to sort of unpick those experiences in relation to you and integrate them. And that's where the kind of usefulness of this experience comes from. But if we sort of juxtapose the I don't know what you'd call it, the drug experience from the psychotic experience or the episode experience or the mental health experience or the spiritual crisis or spiritual awakening experience or the Satori experience, if you want to get a bit Buddhist on this, that's what I framed my first one as when it happened, because it didn't involve any hospitalisation. It was just something kind of spiritual as far as I was concerned, a spiritual kind of breakdown and but awakening at the same time. So if we use the same lens as we use for integrating recreational, I don't want to call it recreational because it's not recreational, that's kind of doing it a disservice. It's kind of a journey to self-enlightenment, isn't it? Not to go kind of enlightenment in general, because that can be used as, it's that whole spiritual ego thing, isn't it? I don't know, drug-induced self-discovery or drug-induced insight. But if we view that as kind of experience and integration, it's like a two-part thing. There isn't really that with the psychotic experience. It's experience, people get involved in the experience and stop it in its tracks kind of halfway through this process. And then there's no integration. There's just a, we mustn't let that ever happen again and please stop thinking about it. Because when you do, you go a bit wafty again. It's just like, well, because kind of all these threads are there waiting to be plucked on and picked up and understood and made into a lovely bloody tapestry rather than just a big ball of scary strings. So I decided, probably in 2022 this started, to really start integrating my experiences all the way back to sort of 2014-15. And prior to that, kind of my traumas as well. Because a lot of this stuff that popped out at the end of the sort of fishing line that went right down into the unconscious was all these traumas from years ago. And the fishing line can be viewed as a temporal line or literally a depth line, like a weighted fishing rod into the very inner self. And like when they catch these fish in the deep, deep depths of the sea, there's some freaky looking things down there, isn't there? And then again, you pull out this fishing line and it scares the shit out of you. I don't want to look at that. And all the doctors are like, have these tablets and it won't happen again and don't think about it. And if you start kind of getting on the same wavelength again, we'll give you more tablets. And I just thought well, fuck this, to be honest. I'm not going to dribble my way through the rest of life. I want to kind of integrate and grow from this. And that was a bloody revelation. It's like, I'm not going to view these things as the enemy. It's like something happened to me. I had some sort of awakening. And that's how I've started to frame it now. Like something mystical happened. You can view it through a material, clinical lens of fear, or you can say, yeah, it was fucking scary. I was scared. I scared a lot of other people. I fucked a lot of shit up for me and other people. I destroyed a lot of relationships and burnt a lot of bridges. But it's like the Aboriginal cleansing fire, isn't it? If you went and looked there, you'd be like, oh, it was a bushfire. It's like, no, they do that every year. And look at the regrowth. It's kind of, they've been doing this for thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. Leave them alone. I don't know, again, these indigenous people who just work with nature, isn't it? And we kind of come in with our big JCBs and you got all these lines of bloody trees in a farm it just, and that's kind of how I see the medical model for a lot of things. So I'm veering off that. I've kind of started to tread my own path. I've let the clinicians come on board and talk to them. I've taken a lot of my power back from people. After my sort of first hospitalisation, my wife was very much in charge and would speak for me. And I condemned myself and gave up and was like, this is me, I'm a ruin, I'm a wreck of a man, and I'll never be anything again, and I'm never going to be able to work in any meaningful capacity, and I'm not going to be able to think again because I've got to take these meds that wreck my working memory and stop my memory recall. And then you think, well, we'll take the meds for a bit, we'll listen to them. I still take them. I'm not making any changes without consulting my psychiatrist. I'm not going off at the deep end, but I am tapering down. They've agreed to that, and I already feel more clear. That's what's got me starting this. I've got some of my faculties back. I'm not operating like a bloody laser robot like I used to. Not a laser robot. Anyway, like laser focus. But I probably don't want to get back into that. There's a new version of me. I've got a smoother edged version now that's less technology orientated and more artistic in nature and expressive. I don't know, more soul driven, I suppose, which I love about me. I think there's a lot of good come out of this. And people who are involved in the experiences will say, you arsehole, how can you say that? And it's just like, well, I'm just finding, I don't know, mushrooms in the fucking pile of shit and listen to them. But there is gold in all this to be found, kind of, in all the detritus that comes with it. It's like you could, I don't know if you've used experience as a garden, you can kind of walk through the garden just looking at the dog shit as you think back on this and try and make sense of it and find purpose and use for it. Or you can look at the flowers, or you can look at both, because you probably need to. I've just passed wind, pardon me. I'm going to leave that in as well, because I'm a human being. And if you've got Crohn's and you fart now and again, or your guts gurgle all the time, you know what I mean? Or you're sitting on the toilet just doing big farty fucking air ones at work in the office. And it's just like, people shouldn't have to work in a fucking office if they don't want to. This is me and my neurodivergent fuck the world side. But yeah, I don't know. I feel you anyway, man, or woman, or kid. But all fucking kids with this shit. Anyway, I'm going off on one, and I'll start crying in a minute. See, I'm just more in touch with me, and because people say you've got no bloody empathy, and it's just like, well, I was kind of autistic and weird and dissociated, so it's hard for me to express empathy, because when I do, it all comes online and it just destroys me. I've literally got tears in my eyes now just thinking about that. Not for me, for fucking little kids and people. It's just, I don't know. The world's not fair, is it? I used to say to my dad, that's not fair. He's like, life's not fair. Just like, well, it should be in your home. At least. It's not going to be at work, but Jesus. So anyway, I've riffed off a bit there, but this will be a bit all over the place, because I'm a bit all over the place. My brain's sort of doing 8 things at once when it's on form. So the fact I can even come up with coherent sentences without pre-recording and editing the shit out of things, I think is good. I'll get better at this, and I won't and but and umming is me kind of changing track in my head between parallel threads. I don't know how many cores I've got. Yeah, or it's, I don't know, or it's considering how to say the next thing so I don't cause offence, but it's just how I speak. It's part of me I'm masking. If you were sitting talking to me, you would get ers and ums. Or maybe you wouldn't, I don't know, I'd have to think on that one a bit. Maybe I'm just a bit nervous because I'm imagining someone listening to this. And someone asked me the other day, how do you imagine kind of the people you're talking to? Is it one person or lots of people? And I said, well, I sit at home now, just kind of dialogue with myself, and because I'm at home on my own, I do it out loud. So I'm just kind of doing that. But I am imagining recording it and someone will hear it. So I have to be maybe a bit careful about what I say and not be unintentionally offensive. So I always try to be kind, I suppose. But not kind where I'm going to let myself be unkind to myself, if that makes sense. But again, there's a whole episode on kindness maybe, and self-acceptance. So this is going to be, quite a multitude of things. And that makes me think about the microbiome, the microviriome and all that, so we can talk about that one. But maybe do that in the Crohn zone and we'll script that a little bit. So where was I? I was talking about DMT. I've covered that really. And then there's 5-MeO-DMT, which as far as I recall is 5-methoxy-DMT, they refer to it as, which is the toad venom one, as I was saying. And that's a very different experience. It's like you're in a void. It's like you're a level above kind of the DMT realm, as I understand it, or I've understood it from reading about other people's experiences. It's like you're in the kind of nirvana Buddhist void, or the all. It's like you're there in the all with the all. Once he's split inside apart from himself and became two things, you are the other thing. So it's you and the all, as I understand it, or you and God, if you want to frame it like that. But I kind of like the whole pantheist approach, like they kind of think that God is everything. And I make sense of that as consciousness is God. So everything is conscious, or consciousness pervades through everything. And I've had experiences where it's just, again, I need to talk about that. I'll talk about that in the episodes one, kind of the mystical framing of the episodes. But feeling that, and all is one, and my consciousness being part of everything, like I've connected into this field. And I've had that without drugs as well, through kind of meditating and asking God something. But there's some really trippy stuff to go over. And I don't mean trippy in a bad way, because I'm not going to do that whole scaredy clinical medical framing. I'm going to just approach it as from mystic curiosity, or through a spiritual lens, if you want to use the term spiritual. And a lot of these people who self-identify as being spiritual, who engage in spiritual practices, if you put them in front of a psychiatrist, the psychiatrist would slap a label on them pretty quickly, schizophrenia or something like that. So they're just people who have gone under the radar a lot of the time. But people who've gone above the radar probably need to be treated in the same way and with the same kind of level of respect and acceptance. In my opinion, I think that's the way forward to a more sort of caring, I don't know about society, because society at large will never really come around to this way of thinking. My realist head, maybe it's pessimism, I don't know. But I'm a big fan of anarchy and decentralisation and sub-communities and subcultures and subgroups. And a lot of these circles already exist within society, don't they? Again, we've got this kind of flower of life thing. So I'll use the flower of life and all these things because they're very good metaphors for things. So I suppose society as well. And I need to do an episode on universal design patterns as well. If you've, again, done any software engineering, you'll be aware of design patterns. And I think there are intrinsic design patterns within sort of the fabric of the universe, the network pattern, for instance. But again, we'll get into that. That's something I've kind of half modelled in my head so far. But a lot of that's come out of my mystical, spiritual, crazy experiences. I don't know if you, insane, mad, crazy. They used to call me Crazy Joe, that was one of my nicknames. Or the Minister for Nonconformity was another. But I kind of, crazy is thinking outside the box, isn't it? Sometimes it's falling out of the box, but There's lots outside the box. So if Dr. Andrew Gallimore's right with his DMT hypothesis, I don't know if you'd call it a hypothesis really, it's DMT framing that consciousness or a consciousness or an aspect of consciousness, the DMT aspect of consciousness, whatever DMT interfaces with, enters your personal human consciousness. Perhaps something similar is going on with 5-MeO-DMT on a higher level of reality. But that doesn't really resonate with me. It's hard for me to sort of conceptualise this because I've never done these drugs. But I've had, again, similar experiences, which I'll talk about in future episodes. But it brings to mind, for me at least, maybe we're existing in lots of different places at once, on lots of different layers of kind of, are these layers even, can we even call them reality, the layers above ours, if there are layers? If there's a layer of consciousness that sits outside of the material, but also runs through the material, is that reality? We're not aware of it, we don't live in it. Most people kind of are stuck in materialism with both feet. I don't say that in a derogatory way, because I used to be like that when I was going to work every day and conforming and kind of in the, just being an air quotes normal person or average Joe. I didn't have time to explore this and kind of getting lost in it, which is the risk of entertaining these thoughts. It makes it very hard to sort of go back and integrate into the real world, again, air quotes. But maybe that's just further on the journey for me. It's like the Buddhists say, before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. But there is this whole dark night of the soul in the middle where you don't fit into anywhere. And New Age spirituality talks about this in terms of 5D experiences and downloads when you're sleeping and all that sort of stuff. But again, I think there are just different schemas around the same sort of thing. That's how I've come to understand it. Like, again, if we're talking therapy circles, you've got schema therapy, ISS, and the whole model for structural dissociation. They're all kind of the same thing, just talking about it in different frameworks. Because some things resonate. It's like we all learn, we've got a different learning style. Some people are kinesthetic learners, they learn from doing things. Like some people can just hear instructions, they're auditory learners. Some people can watch someone doing something and learn that way. And we've all got a kind of a mix of these different learning styles, which makes our own personal learning style. So all these different frameworks and modes of teaching things are suitable for different people. I don't think you can actually teach anyone anything, you can just facilitate their learning, personally. But that's me, again, getting caught up with words. I'm very literal and absolutist with words, which can be a pain in the arse, but I don't know, hopefully it makes me speak a bit more clearly, but I often talk in metaphor as well, because I find that's, I don't know, it's like speaking in symbols almost, isn't it? So as I continue to explore my experiences and my framing of them and their interplay and connection with my understanding of reality and my, I don't, you could call it a religious model even if you want to do that, if that makes sense to you, or my model for reality, or because they're one and the same for me. We'll explore all this other stuff because it's all so interconnected, really. We haven't even got to the nature side of things, plant spirits and whatnot yet. I'm very interested in that. My friend's very into shamanism or shamanism, so we'll probably be talking to him in future and get his sort of perspective on things. If he's up for that, it'd be very interesting. But yeah, I'd like to talk to people from sort of different spiritual backgrounds as well. Because I think there is a, when I was in hospital, not last time, but the time before, I was in there with a plastic surgeon. Well, he'd done lots of things. He was a plastic surgeon, he was a doctor. He used to do bladder replacements for sort of teenagers whose bladders had been screwed up by ketamine. He was doing sex change operations at one point, but then kind of had a bit of a moral dilemma and stopped doing that. But he was a Muslim, and I hadn't had a lot of exposure to Islam at all, other than the stuff we get on the news, really. But there's a mystical school of that. Sufism is kind of the mystical side of, like, it's what Kabbalah is to Judaism, really. I mean, there's so much to all this, and I kind of view all these world religions as like branches on a tree, and at the top there's this kind of star, which is the energy that permeates everything. Maybe it's love. I think it probably is love. Personally, that's how I frame it. Like, love is the ultimate energy, and not love as in, I don't know, we'd have to do a whole episode on love as well, because that word, I've spent years musing on that word. It's caused me so many problems, my understanding of it, and everyone thinks it's different, something different to everyone. But I don't know, the other day I came up with the idea that love is kindness in motion. That kind of made sense to me. Got the act of love. Because if kindness isn't doing anything, love is not there. It's when that kindness becomes alive. Love is born from that. I think about weird things. Maybe that resonates. I don't know. It made sense to me and still does. So I think that's about it for this one. I've gone on quite a while. But this provides good background for the future ones. If you haven't listened to this, they're going to not make much sense. So I'll probably refer back to this one. And as always, if there's anything I've brought up or touched upon here, and you'd like me to go into further detail about it in a future one, or do a whole episode about anything I mention, I'm interested in everything I talk about. I'm a man who knows a little bit about a lot of things, and a lot about some things, if I'm being kind to myself. I am a proper nerd and a geek and all those sort of words. I've always kind of identified as that. But I'll always be a grunger at heart. Not that I'm dirty, I just like baggy clothes and whatnot. I was very into Nirvana and the whole Seattle scene as a teenager. Alice in Chains and Lane Staley, etc. I think he's still my favourite singer. Probably by, quite a margin. I don't know. Anyway. And as I said, as this progresses, it will get a bit more professional, and I will start adding video and things to it, and probably talking direct to camera. But I'm not going to spend loads of money racing ahead with this. I'll take it slow and steady for once, and not rush, and let things develop organically. And I'm not going to put out episodes just because it's due. It's like when things are bubbling up and the volcano kind of feels ready to erupt, I'll do an episode. That's probably a bad metaphor, that sounds chaotic. When something is arising and I feel it warrants sharing, I'll do another episode. Or if someone's made a request, we'll use that format for now. That seems to work. So hopefully I haven't bored you too much with all the tangents, but I think, as I said, it's important to sort of cover this background stuff before I go into any further detail on the things I've mentioned. And forgive my belly rumbles. My belly rumbles all the time. I heard it when I listened back to the last one. There was one big belly rumble. And I was smoking cigarettes while talking as well. So I may edit that out in future. If you haven't heard me doing that in this one, then I've already done it. But if you want to just hear it authentic, then let me know and I'll stick with that style. But I don't know. Alan Watts and Ginsberg and people like that used to chain smoke, didn't they, while doing things? And it helps me think. It's just me naturally being me when I'm doing something like this. Although I intend to give up smoking soon because it isn't good for Crohn's, so they say. But it's good for colitis, ironically. So none of this makes any bloody sense, does it? Anyway. So thanks for listening. I hope it been of some use or has been interesting in some way at least. And speak again soon. Lots of love.